In this presentation, we are going to go through the key steps of developing and implementing a climate change monitoring and evaluation framework. The purpose of an M&E framework is to help you track the implementation of your climate change response plan. There are generally three components to a monitoring and evaluation framework. These are monitoring, evaluation, and reporting. Different M&E systems use slightly different terminology, like verification and assessment, but the principles are generally the same. You need to start off with a way to monitor or measure what you're doing. Once you've collected this information, you need to assess or evaluate whether you're achieving your goals, and if not, what needs to change. You should then report on your progress and how you plan to change your program in the future to make sure you are achieving your goals. The first step, monitoring, consists of two parts. These are tracking the actual implementation of what you said you would do in your climate change response plan. The second is tracking how successful you were in what you set out to do. The evaluation step is based on your results from the monitoring step, and the reporting steps consist of two slightly different parts. These are alignment with local reporting requirements and alignment with provincial and national reporting requirements. In the next few slides, we will go through these three steps in more detail to help you to develop your own M&E framework. The first step under monitoring is to track the actual implementation of what you said you would do in your climate change response plan. With this step, you are trying to work out if the tasks and projects that were identified in the climate change response plan are actually being implemented. A way to think about this step is to ask yourself the question, did we do what we said we would do? To be able to monitor implementation, it is necessary to break it down into different components. You can start with an overall goal. This will be linked to your priority climate change vulnerability that you are trying to address. In our example, on this slide, the goal is to manage increased impacts on informal dwellings. The next step is to identify the deliverables required to achieve this goal. The deliverables are the measurable things that you want to achieve. In our example, we have set out one deliverable: report on risk from intense rainfall events for informal dwellings between the M13 and Rick Turner Road. You may have a number of deliverables for each goal. For each deliverable, you should allocate who is responsible for the deliverable and by when. If you have a list of deliverables, then it is possible to monitor these deliverables to see if they've been achieved and answer the question, did we do what we said we would do? As you can see in this case or report, on the risk from intense rainfall events for informal dwellings between M13 and Rick Turner, it was completed by the end of the year. So the answer is, yes, we did do what we said we would do. A second component of monitoring is tracking the success of a particular intervention. In this step, we are not asking whether the task was completed, but rather, was it the right thing to do? A way to think about this step is to ask the question, did we address the climate change impacts? As with the previous step, a way to monitor your success in addressing the climate change impact is to break it down into different components. You can start with an overall goal. This will be linked to your priority climate change vulnerability that you are trying to address. In our example again, the goal is to manage increased impact on informal dwellings. The next step is to set a target for success. The target is what you want to achieve through this particular goal. In our example, we've set the target informal dwellings less vulnerable to the increased impacts from the intense rainfall events. You generally do not have more than one target for each goal when monitoring success. Next up is indicator of success. This is a measure of achieving your target. You could think of it as what outcomes are you trying to achieve with this particular target. In our example, we have the indicator of success as comprehensive disaster management systems in place for shack informal dwellings between M13 and Rick Turner Road. The next component of your monitoring framework is the baseline. This gives an indication of where you are when you start out trying to achieve this particular target. In our example, we have a baseline of only municipal-wide disaster management plans are in place, which says that in trying to manage increased impact on informal dwellings, we only have a municipal disaster management plan that's in place. If you have a clear target and indicators of success, then it's possible to monitor if the deliverables were the right things to do. In order to achieve the target and goal, as you can see, in this case, a report on risks from intense rainfall events for informal dwellings between M13 and Rick Turner Road was completed by the end of the year. But this did not meet the target of informal dwellings being less vulnerable to the increased impacts from intense rainfall events, as no comprehensive disaster management system was put in place. The second component of an M&E framework is evaluation. In this step, you are aiming to be more critical of your program to see where the successes as well as the failures were. A way to incorporate an evaluation into your M&E framework is to ask the question, how are you revising the climate change response plan? There are a few steps you can consider when reviewing your climate change response plan. These are: review your climate change vulnerabilities, and this can be done by redoing the climate change vulnerability assessment with other stakeholders or just as a desktop exercise. The purpose of the step is to check if vulnerabilities in the area have changed over time. Number 2 is to review priority climate change responses. This can also be done with key stakeholders in a workshop format or as a desktop exercise. The purpose of this step is to check if the response plan is addressing the correct priorities. Number 3 is review implementation of responses and adjust these if needed. Once you've reviewed your vulnerabilities and responses, and based on the information you gathered during the monitoring phase, you can decide whether you will need to adjust any of your responses. For instance, in the example discussed previously, it was clear that the deliverable that was achieved did not address the actual climate change impact. As a result, that specific response should be adjusted to ensure it addresses the actual climate change impact. Number 4. Once you have decided on the necessary adjustments to your responses, you can update your climate change response plan. It's a good idea to try and review and update your climate change response plan on an annual basis and redo it every 5 years in line with the IDP review process. The third component of the M&E framework is reporting. The intention of the reporting phase is to make sure your activities are aligned with other programs happening locally, provincially, as well as nationally. Reporting also helps with stakeholder communication and buy-in, which is critical for successful climate change response. The first step under reporting is to align with local municipal or program level reporting requirements. A way to think about this step is to ask yourself the question, how are you reporting your progress to local stakeholders? There are a few steps you can consider when reporting on your climate change response plan locally. These are you reporting progress of your climate change responses in the Municipal Services Delivery and Budget Implementation Plan, or SDBIP? Are your climate change responses being reflected in the municipal sector plans? And finally, are you reporting back to your community and your key stakeholders? The second step under reporting is to align with provincial and national level reporting requirements. A way to think about this step is to ask yourself the question, how are you reporting your progress provincially and nationally? There are a few steps you can consider when reporting on your climate change response plan nationally and provincially. These are you reporting progress of your climate change responses in terms of the national desired adaptation outcomes? Are your climate change responses being reflected in the provincial annual performance plan? Are your climate change responses being reflected in the provincial climate change strategy implementation plan? If you are not reporting through any of these processes, then you should contact the officials who manage these reports and find out what their requirements are so that your climate change activities can be reflected in the reports. Once you have done this step, you will have a functional monitoring and evaluation framework. As with other planning processes, this framework can be reviewed and updated over time as your systems improve.